Hi, my name is Keesecker. I'm the Program Director of Artist Development at Springboard for the Arts. And I'm here today to talk about a section of your McKnight application where you get to choose between your bio, a resume, or 10 artistic experiences with focus on 2 of them. So I've titled this Telling Your Story, What We Write About When We Write About Ourselves. So again, I'm from Springboard. We're a nonprofit arts organization, economic development and community development in Lowertown, St. Paul. There's our website, should you want to get in touch with us. And the way I'm sort of framing this up is in your application, as you heard already, you are required to do an artist statement. You are required to have a works list, and then you have the choice of these 3 other options for sort of fleshing out the rest of the work or the story that you're telling to support your work samples. And so my presentation right now, or this information, is meant to talk specifically about those different elements to help you best determine which of those will serve your application and your work samples most effectively. So, question to start with yourself is, what is your story and how can you best communicate that story to a reader? We'll look at the specifics of this, but first let's address our goals, which is that the most important aspect of these McKnight applications, as you've heard, is the work sample. That said, all the other elements, the artist statement, the works list, and the bio, resume, or artistic experiences, is meant to create a framework for understanding. And that framework can have 3 main components that we think about. Number 1 is context, which is to say, what surrounds the work, and we'll look at some specific example of these in a little bit. Meaning that the work exists somewhere, what else is in the vicinity of the work, its environment and whatnot. Another goal of these application materials is to guide the reader or listener to say, this is what's important, or did you know this is what I'm referencing, which is to say that if they just listen to a piece alone, it can be great, but with written materials and supporting materials, you can help them better understand what's happening in your work samples, which is another way of saying it's meant to deepen their understanding of what they've heard. I usually equate this to times when you've listened to a piece of music or seen a movie or read a book. You meet up with a friend and they say, I loved that work. Did you know this about the author? And they give you some historical context from the writer, and all of a sudden that story or that album or that performance opens up a whole new set of understanding. These are the goals that your supporting materials should be aimed at. Helping people gain context, guide them to understanding, and having deeper insights into the work samples. I also like to point out that I prefer to frame all of these materials as being additive and not subtractive, meaning that we assume that a panelist or an adjudicator doesn't look at your artist statement and try to mark you down for points. So it's not that they will take away from your likelihood of success, but that it can only improve on their understanding of the works. So maybe that's my optimism, but I do think that if you approach it in that way and not worry about whether they're going to dislike the writing or the statement, but just that they're going to know more afterwards, then there's only one way to go, and that's up. So at the end of these 3 goals, we're hoping that we come out with a succinct story that encapsulates your passion, your vision, and what is most significant about you and your work. And that succinct story includes all parts of your application. It's a combination of the work sample, the artist statement, the works list, and then one of these 3 optional elements that I'm going to talk about in a second. But together, they're all telling a different angle or facet of you as an artist and how you and your work exist in the world. So every piece of this application material gives you a new lens that you can show new detail and bring that person, that reader, viewer, listener along with you. So we're going to talk about the three options that you have to choose from, what some examples of those might be, and then pros and cons of each of them. And those three elements again are: you can choose to write a bio, a resume, or a list of experiences, 10 artistic experiences, 2 of which you go into in more detail. Those were covered in the guideline overview. So let's talk about some examples of what you might cover here. Context. That can include political, technological, economic, philosophical. As I said, it's the landscape, the environment, the other events and things and people happening around the work. The question to say, if you are interested in talking about context, which of these 3 document options feels like it's the most effective for talking about context? And this will pop back up in terms of the pros and cons. You can talk about historical information. Where do you fit into the timeline? Where do you come from? That can also be aspirational, in that given the history of work or the current landscape today, where do you see your vision of pushing the work toward through your music? Another one would be physical characteristics. You can talk about the medium you work in, your style, the scale and scope of your work, if you work primarily in solo unaccompanied, or if you're more large-scale orchestral pieces, or mixtures and somewhere in between. But these are all physical descriptions of the work, and then you can back those up with justifications for what it is that you're doing. We can talk about subject matter, so we understand themes, patterns, and topics that can be closely related to context. So maybe your work has text, and therefore you can address topics directly with language, political, technology, economic, secular or religious, and so on and so forth. Other things might be patterns in the work or the body of work that you might find particularly engaging. This is an interesting one, but the culture of your music and where it fits into the now, as I call it. So how does your work connect to now? What is most relevant, or as I define relevancy, who cares and why now? And a lot of times that has deep and significant cultural roots that you can work on. And then the last one is you can address vision, interest, background, and goals. So this is a little bit of a forward thinking. Historical, you could say, it's important to say what soil or where are my roots. And this one is vision, interest, and goals would say what do I see as the future of music or my music in my artistic practice. So these again are not like a complete list, but they are intended to give you sort of a starter on angles at which you could approach in any of these 3 formats, including your artist statement. So I'm going to go through one-on-one and talk about pros and cons. We'll start with the resume. This is perhaps one of the more traditional from an application standpoint that you might have prepared already. Its strengths are that it holds a lot of information that doesn't read well in narrative form. So if you're really into listing all of your premieres and awards, of which you have 30, writing those into a bio where it's just a comma-separated bio is, one, hard to read, and 2, not very fun to read. But in a resume, you can list those out in a bullet list form where people can absorb it quickly and get a better picture of the scope of that type of information. It's highly formatted, it's very structured, therefore it's easy to read. You're not dealing with extraneous information and adjectives and supporting text and sentence structure, and so you can get through a lot of information quickly, easy to access. It tends to be more neutral in that it can have a style. You can format it, you can take a stylistic angle to a resume and it'll live just fine, but it has a tendency to be less unique in its tone, so to speak. Which brings us to the challenges. Challenges. First one being, the flip side of that is has less room for voice. In a bio or a list of experiences or an artist statement, there's a lot of room for you to show your passion and your vision through the type of language and the way you describe things. And resumes are not intended to share that kind of information. So if that feels like a strong aspect of your personality or your work, then you might want to look to one of the other formats. Those same formatting constraints that make a resume easy to structure can also restrict you from being able to communicate in a way. It constrains you a bit and can limit your ability to express sort of the full picture of your work. And then on the downside, some people don't like more neutral or more traditional, and that's okay too. Another challenge of resumes is that they are categorizing, meaning that they tend to want to put things into tiny little boxes. If your method of describing your work doesn't fit neatly into those sorts of categories, it can be a frustrating format and document to work with. And then my personal opinion is that resumes are boring, and that because of their lack of voice and their formal constraints and neutralness and boxiness, they may not provide you with all the flexibility you want or need in order to give the best rounded out picture of your work. All right, so next we're going to do same sort of presentation about bios. So the strengths we'll start with is that your bio different than your artist statement. So remember, actually before I do this, that you do have a complete works list. So you don't need to necessarily cover that ground in this document. You do have a separate artist statement, which is a lot of entailed in your vision that gets covered in the guideline information. And your bio is kind of a rounded out story that mixes these together into a narrative format. Strength of it is that the format is open and flexible. You can structure this narrative in any way you want, either in fragments or in long form, but allows you a huge breadth to capture the story of you, as we were talking about. It allows for a formalized voice and style, so you can be, how would we say, a little bit more removed if you want, meaning that if you have, if it's challenging for you to write from that first person talking about yourself because of your humbleness and sometimes taking a more formal position in a bio format, an academic approach, can really open things up and allow you to cover more territory. Again, if it's structured, it is structured to carry a story or a narrative, meaning that, like your artist statement, you begin at point A, you present information and experiences and take people on a journey through the story of you and end up in a place where the reader or listener feels different. The context, they've been educated, they have a deeper understanding, and that can be a really creative space for you if you enjoy that kind of work, and definitely use your personal voice. And then the last one on the strength side is highlighting notable accomplishments and providing deeper context. Although the resume is great at carrying a lot of information and a lot of data, I've seen this time and time again where someone has a really notable experience, but it was, say, 10 years ago. So in a resume where it's in reverse chronological order, that notable experience could be 1/3 halfway down the page. And it's really not given the weight or the real estate that it deserves in terms of the trajectory of your career. A bio allows you to focus in directly on those really meaningful experiences and say, this was super big, this was super important, and I want to talk about that. and focus on it as a pivotal point from which all these other opportunities in my career have sprung. So that's a real big strength for a bio format. Some of the challenges is long lists don't work well in them. So as I mentioned, that listing format where you just have a block of text, usually, I think traditionally, they always seem to show up 2/3 of the way down the page after you've done the interesting stuff, and then people just sort of plop a pile of like awards and premieres and ensembles in front of you. And it makes for a really disappointing story arc, I think. The doldrums of the bio, as I call it. Doldrums of the bio. And so in that sense, trying to cram that information into a bio is not a great and fitting use of that medium. They are a little bit more traditional in that if you say I'm submitting a bio, people expect certain types of information, which might be education, background, teachers, just a little bit more academic, as I would call it. I could be wrong. You can write the 21st century bio and blow the lid off it, and that would be great. But if you come to it with the frame or the context that a biography is a formalized document that can sometimes prevent you or hinder you from being bold enough to tell an authentic story from your point of view or your voice. I think we kind of get hung up in those templates sometimes, or tropes. And then the last is that, similar to the art statement, it requires careful crafting. If the resume is a traditional document, that it has all of its formalities and boxes and there's not a lot of creativity there, when you're given more options and more space, you have more choices and more priorities to make, and structural things and pacing, style, editing. And so for some people, that is the challenge to bios that hinders their voice, is that that's not their strong suit. Writing in that style doesn't serve their portfolio best. And so that's something to look out for. And then the last option of the three is a list of 10 artistic experiences wherein you are asked to go into depth on 2 of them. And this is a really interesting and new format for this year in the application. So we're going to look at some of the options here. So flexible, non-traditional format. Because you don't see this option on a lot of applications, it doesn't have the baggage of history, and that the expectations for what it should look like are not there. Therefore, it's wide open. You get to create this thing, however you want to talk about your 10 experiences to in depth. It could be a bulleted list. It could be a narrative story that is in 10 mini micro chapters. It could be 10 tweets and 2 longer tweets, perhaps. I mean, it's like you could get very creative with this and not worry at all about does somebody know what this is supposed to look like. You can't see my air quotes, supposed to be like. Strengths would be offers variety. I kind of went over that one ahead just a little bit, but that you can move around a lot more. In a bio or an artist statement, we tend to expect as a reader a continuous development or a through line that connects everything in very, I'd say, a linear paced fashion. If you're allowed to, what you're allowed here is to talk about 10 diverse, non-connected experiences, you can move time and space as you wish. You can hop around. They don't have to be in chronological order necessarily. If it's not about time, but it's more about the relationships you establish, then that to me really opens up a lot of possibilities for you to express best what your experience as a composer has been, rather than saying I must squeeze my life as a composer into the traditional narrative arc of a linear storyline in a bio or a chronologically ordered bulleted list in a resume. So again, a lot of flexibility, a lot of creative options. It can be anecdotal and story driven. I think Anecdotes are very powerful. Stories are very powerful, where you lay out something poignant, a little snippet of your life, and you don't have to deeply describe it, but the combination of placing them together next to each other on a plate or a table in front of somebody, the relationships become apparent based on what you have selected. Again, more flexibility, more creative options to choose what best describes you. And then, similar to the bio, but different, is it allows you to highlight meaningful events. And sometimes those events can be outside of your artistic practice. You know, maybe it was your firstborn child, or a book where you were, what you were eating when you read a certain literary work for the first time that really sparked a lot of, like, a new chapter in your life. These are non-composer music specific things that sometimes in a narrative are hard to fit in. Be like, how do I make this segue? How do I take this tangent and then tie it back in? You burn a lot of words and energy trying to take the off ramp, get gas, and then get back on. This format can allow you to jump around and be more efficient with those highlights, while still in a narrative structure to sorts. Holds experiences that may not fit well in other formats. So an extension of that is, I think a lot of times people say, this thing happened to me and it seems it's really important to me and I just don't know where it fits into your application. Or you have a resume that each category of your resume has somewhere between 5 and 10 items, and then you have this one experience that doesn't have a bucket, it doesn't have a category, and so you don't know where it belongs. And to put it in its own category with just one item feels like you're shortchanging it or something. This list is great for holding the Wunderkammer cabinet of curiosities, right? And that can be an exciting way to talk about your work. The challenges is that, like the bio, requires careful crafting. I don't know that a slapdash approach to just throwing important things on there is going to serve you well, and you need to be thoughtful about the order and the topics that you choose. Again, curatorial choices. You have to look at the entire scope of your career and say, which 10 things are most important? What are my top 10? And that can be hard to leave some of your children off the list or something and say, like, this is really important, but it's number 11, so you're not going to make the cut, string quartet. And that's a real thing. Next up would be capturing the scope of your work, in that if you are taking highlights, sometimes you might say, well, here's 10 snapshots, but I feel like I'm leaving a lot on the table. In which case, I will remind you with the next slide that this is a mixture, right? So keep in mind that when you have these required work sample, artist statement, and works list is going to cover a lot of material. And that when you then go to this other step of choosing between a resume, a bio, and an experience, remember that if you have already covered the material, like a list of awards and ensembles in the works list, perhaps, or not awards, but list of works with the ensembles, perhaps, in another document, then you don't have to worry about not mentioning it in your bio or going into depth on it. So you're really, as we put this together, I urge people to take a global look at the whole package and make sure that they are capturing different types of information and putting them into the type of document that best serves that information, and that the panel looks at it collectively, or they look at all of the written materials collectively in support of the work sample. Because again, as it's been iterated in the guidelines, the work sample is still the most important part. This presentation is hopefully giving you some thoughts and ideas around considering which items you pair together, and maybe even trying one of each and seeing which one feels best for you. Translating your resume into a bio can be challenging, but turning a resume or a bio into a list of experiences, maybe not so hard, or experiences into a bio. Maybe those are some other ideas or exercises for you to play with as you're putting these materials together. So that is kind of an overview and some thought exercises for you to look at. I'll put my information back up here in case you have specific questions. Springboard does offer paid consulting at an hourly rate, and if you're interested in using that service, which is to say you can meet with me one-on-one to go over application materials. We don't write it, but we will edit it with you and talk through some of the elements and troubleshoot to try to sharpen it up as best as possible. You're welcome to reach out to me at Springboard for the Arts to do that, as I'm sure Billy is also willing to help. So thank you for your time. Good luck, and we'll see you soon.